Welcome to the Asbestos Awareness Online Module, Tier 2. Asbestos awareness learning has been divided into two tiers. Tier 1 covers asbestos topics that all PDSB staff should know, while Tier 2 learning includes all topics covered in Tier 1, plus additional specific information for custodial, maintenance, and supervisory staff. Upon completion of this module, participants should understand the definition and types of asbestos, as well as the potential health risks of exposure. Know common locations where asbestos may be found. How to review asbestos surveys and inventories, both on paper and electronically, and how to review if a material might be asbestos-containing. Understand the general difference between Type 1, 2, and 3 asbestos operations. Become familiar with the objectives of the PDSB Asbestos Management Program. Understand how information on asbestos is stored, communicated, and updated, including work orders and notifications, and know what to do if you encounter damaged or disturbed asbestos. It is important to understand that this module is not designed to instruct on asbestos abatement, removal, or handling. This module is intended to educate workers and supervisors about the general risks of asbestos, as well as the control measures that are in place for their protection. In this chapter, we will learn more about asbestos, what it is, the different types of asbestos, and its classifications. Asbestos refers to a group of naturally occurring fibers mined from rock. Asbestos fibers are naturally resistant to heat and fire and very strong. Because of these properties, asbestos fibers were used in hundreds of applications, primarily in the manufacturing of building and construction materials. It is important to note that a material is not asbestos, but a material may contain asbestos. This is why you will often hear the term asbestos-containing material, or ACM. There are two types of asbestos-containing materials: friable and non-friable. It is important to know the friability of a material so we can take appropriate precautions when we work around, repair, or remove the material. As defined by Ontario legislation, asbestos is considered friable when it can be crumbled, pulverized, or powdered by hand pressure when dry. It presents an inhalation risk because friable asbestos fibers are more easily released into the air. Some examples of friable asbestos include the fireproofing of steel structures and is found on beams, columns, trusses, etc., or thermal insulation to insulate pipes and boilers, which was then covered with canvas or other sheet materials. Non-friable asbestos means the asbestos fibers are bound or locked into the product matrix so that the fibers are not readily released and therefore pose a low risk if left undisturbed. There is only a risk for fiber release when the material is subject to significant abrasion through activities such as sanding or cutting with electric power tools, or if the condition of the material deteriorates. Some examples of non-friable asbestos include vinyl floor tiles, acoustic ceiling tiles, and asbestos cement boards and pipes, usually referred to by its trade name, transite. We've just reviewed that friable ACM can pose a greater risk of releasing asbestos fibers if disturbed, and that non-friable ACM poses a lesser risk of asbestos exposure if disturbed. But what does disturbed mean? Disturbed means damaged in some way, perhaps due to a flood, explosion, or fire. ACM can also be damaged by improper work procedures. For example, a contractor cutting into friable pipe insulation without taking the required precautions. Materials can also be disturbed during major building renovations or demolition. Disturbed does not mean simply being in a room with ACM, walking on ACM floor tiles, or touching a wall with ACM plaster coating. Examples of asbestos-containing materials that have been disturbed are on the screen. Do not clean up these materials by yourself. We'll discuss what to do if you encounter disturbed ACM in Chapters 5 and 7. How do we know if a material is asbestos-containing? The only accurate way to identify asbestos is to do a microscopic analysis of the suspected material. However, there are some common factors that may provide clues as whether the material is asbestos-containing. These factors include the age of the building or structure, the type of construction used for the building, the nature of the equipment used within the structure, and the appearance of the asbestos-containing material. Does the building I work in contain asbestos? Buildings and other structures built prior to the 1970s likely used asbestos-containing material for pipe and boiler insulation. The use of asbestos for fireproofing measures ceased in 1974. Although legislation prohibited the production of friable asbestos products in the early 1970s, some installation continued until the early 1980s. As a result, the PDSB has completed asbestos surveys for buildings constructed prior to 1990. The PDSB Asbestos Management Program contains a list of locations that have surveys and will be discussed in further detail in a later chapter. But let's discuss how to recognize ACMs further. It is important to understand the types of asbestos-containing materials at the PDSB and what types of materials are tested as part of an asbestos survey. When an asbestos survey is created, accessible materials are tested. Accessible means materials that are easily reached and touched, and therefore easily disturbed, or are often in need of repair or may need to be disturbed as part of the general maintenance of a building. Inaccessible materials are not usually included in an asbestos survey. Inaccessible materials are not easily reached or touched, such as under flooring or above ceiling spaces. Sometimes the act of sampling an inaccessible material may actually cause damage. For example, sampling pipe insulation that is above a ceiling space may involve cutting into the ceiling. When an asbestos survey is created, accessible materials are tested, inaccessible materials are sampled before repairs, renovations, and demolitions. The following is a general list of accessible materials that are typically sampled when creating an asbestos survey and inventory, and are not meant to be comprehensive. Vinyl floor tiles, ceiling and acoustic tiles, insulation on pipes and boilers, transite products, textured coatings, drywall joint compound, and exterior materials such as textured coatings on soffit and transite panels. Here are some examples of inaccessible materials that may contain ACM. Do not disturb these materials unless they have been tested and are proven non-ACM. Roofing materials such as felts, tar, caulking, and asphalt. Mastic or glue under vinyl floor tiles or behind wall tiles and corkboards. Interior and exterior brick mortar, as well as the grout found between ceramic floor and wall tiles. Interior and exterior caulking around doors and windows. Fireproofing spray on structural beams and on the underside of roofs. And sometimes pavement asphalt on the grounds around the property. Vermiculite insulation was sold in the U.S. and Canada from approximately the 1920s to 1990 as Zonolite and possibly other brands. Asbestos is not intrinsic to vermiculite. However, a major source of vermiculite sold in Canada was from Libby, Montana, where there was a very large deposit of asbestiform minerals in the vermiculite mine. For this reason, approach vermiculite insulation found inside walls at schools that were built before 1990 with caution. In this chapter, we have learned about what asbestos is, the two main classes of asbestos-containing materials, and examples of ACM. Next, we will learn about potential health risks of exposure to asbestos. This chapter will review the risk of asbestos exposure as well as the health risks. Asbestos poses a health risk when fibers are in the air and inhaled by a person. Therefore, the lower the exposure to asbestos, the lower the risk of developing an asbestos-related disease. Exposure risks depend on the amount of asbestos fibers in the air, concentration, how long the exposure lasts, length of exposure, how often you were exposed, frequency of exposure, the size and type of the asbestos fibers inhaled, and the amount of time since your first exposure.
Asbestos, is a fibrous mineral that's resistant to chemicals and heat, and very tough. It was also added to the building materials of many older homes. As a worker or homeowner, the hazard exists when undertaking a renovation or demolition. The danger is releasing the asbestos fibers into the air. When a worker breathes, asbestos fibers enter the mouth and nose and flow down the air passages deep into the lungs. The fibers lodge in the delicate lung tissue where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells try and break down the asbestos fibers and become damaged and die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more fibers embed in the lungs. Asbestos fibers can remain in the lungs for long periods, and the scar tissue that results continues to develop for many years after exposure. Eventually, so much scar tissue develops that the lungs stop working. Since the year 2000, more workers have died from asbestos disease in BC than any other workplace injury. For information on how to protect yourself from asbestos exposure, visit WorksafeBC.com.
There are 3 common illnesses related to asbestos exposure. They are asbestosis, mesothelioma, and lung cancer. All of these diseases have a long latency period of 10 to 45 years, meaning it can be many years before a person develops an asbestos-related illness and truly knows the effects of asbestos exposure. Asbestosis is not a cancer. However, it is a serious long-term disease that affects the lungs. When asbestos fibers are inhaled, they can irritate and inflame the tissues of the lungs. As a result, the lung tissues become scarred, making it difficult for the lungs to perform their natural function of allowing oxygen and carbon dioxide to exchange. The disease causes distressed breathing and progressively becomes disabling and potentially fatal. The latency period, or the amount of time it can lay dormant or be undetected, for asbestosis is usually between 10 and 20 years after the first exposure. People who have had significant exposure to asbestos are at risk of developing mesothelioma, a rare form of cancer. Mesothelioma affects the mesothelium, which is the lining of the lung cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the heart sac. It also covers the internal reproductive organs. The most common site for the development of mesothelioma is the lining of the lung cavity. Most cases of mesothelioma are diagnosed 30 years or more after the first exposure to asbestos. Mesothelioma has been diagnosed in asbestos workers with direct exposure to asbestos, as well as in family members through indirect exposure to asbestos. Although the majority of people who develop lung cancer are smokers or those who have been exposed to secondhand smoke, lung cancer can also develop by inhaling asbestos fibers. Lung cancer is a malignant tumor that attacks and obstructs the air passages of the respiratory system. In this chapter, we have learned about the risk of asbestos exposure and the health risks, including the 3 main types of asbestos-related illnesses. The key to reducing potential exposure to asbestos is for workplaces to have a fulsome asbestos management program that is compliant with the law. Persons taking this Tier 2 model may also be responsible for making important, time-sensitive decisions that directly impact others. For these reasons, it is important that you are well informed of potential asbestos hazards and understand the legislation. The following chapter reviews some key points of the asbestos legislation. The foundation of all health and safety laws in Ontario is the Internal Responsibility System. This system emphasizes the importance of the relationship between workers and supervisors. Supervisors and workers have a legal duty to work together to identify, communicate, and resolve workplace hazards. Always report workplace safety concerns to your supervisor, manager, or administrator so they can address them. In Ontario, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, asbestos is prescribed as a designated substance and is regulated under OREG 27805, applicable to construction projects and in buildings and repair operations. OREG 27805 provides specific definitions and explanations of asbestos-containing materials and friable materials, implementation of an asbestos management program, bulk sampling requirements, asbestos work operations, and clearance air sampling requirements. Health and safety legislation clearly points out information that must be provided to a worker, as is the case with OREG 27805. In addition, the Occupational Health and Safety Act also tells us that employers must acquaint a worker with the hazards in the workplace and provide the worker with information and instruction to protect the health or safety of a worker. How do we do that here at the PDSB? We have created asbestos surveys and inventories for all buildings constructed up to 1990 that are available to all workers. We have created an asbestos management program that is available to all workers. We have specific information about asbestos-containing materials in our work order system. And we have created this asbestos awareness module. Ontario Regulation 27805 defines operations that may expose workers to asbestos as Type 1, 2, and 3 operations and provides information on how the work shall be completed. Here at the PDSB, all types of asbestos work are done by qualified outside contractors. The Board aims to plan this work outside of daytime building hours and when buildings are heavily occupied. In an emergency, work may be done during regular hours so long as the area can be left unoccupied. Type 1 operations generally are low-risk operations as it involves working with non-friable materials or small quantities of materials. Examples of Type 1 operations are listed on the screen. A common example of a Type 1 operation is removing a section of vinyl floor tiles. During a Type 1 operation, workers only wear personal protective equipment upon request. Drop sheets are used to control dust, along with damp wiping and/or HEPA filter vacuums. Compressed air is not used, and materials are wetted with a wetting agent to control dust before removing with non-powered tools. Waste is collected in a special bag, often yellow in color, and removed by the contractor to dispose of as asbestos waste. Examples of Type 1 operations at PDSB include replacing a few damaged vinyl floor tiles, replacing a few ACM ceiling tiles, and cutting into a small section of drywall ceiling to create an access hatch. Type 2 operations involve working on moderate areas of asbestos-containing materials, or circumstances where ACM is more likely to crumble during the course of work. The legislation contains a full list of Type 2 operations. Type 2 operations that may occur at the PDSB include removal of sections of drywall where the joint compound is asbestos-containing, removing small portions of pipe insulation in order to repair the piping beneath, or removing and replacing a classroom's worth of asbestos-containing ceiling tiles. Some of the measures and procedures for completing a Type 2 operation include use clearly visible signage indicating a warning of an asbestos dust hazard and that the area is restricted to only workers who are wearing protective clothing equipment. Wear protective clothing that is provided by the employer, including a NIOSH-approved respirator as described in the regulation. Polyethylene drop sheets or other similar products are to be used to create barriers that separates the work area. Use appropriate asbestos waste containers that are suitable for the type of waste, impervious to asbestos, and identified as asbestos waste. Disable the ventilation system and seal ducts to and from the work area. Decontaminate protective clothing using HEPA vacuum or damp wiping before removing protective clothing. Glove bag removals are considered Type 2 operations under the regulation. A glove bag is a manufactured bag-type enclosure that is used for safely removing asbestos-containing material, such as insulation on pipes and from other small areas. The glove bag is equipped with built-in sleeves and gloves and is placed around the asbestos material and sealed to ensure safe asbestos removal. Glove bag operations are used to prevent the release of asbestos fibers into the work area outside the bag. It is important to remember that all Type 2 operation procedures apply to the glove bag operations. Type 3 operations are generally large-scale activities which will likely generate significant levels of airborne asbestos. Examples of a Type 3 operation include removing more than 1 square meter of friable asbestos and disturbing non-friable asbestos materials using power tools not equipped with dust-collecting HEPA filters. Under OREG 27805, workers and their supervisors who may conduct Type 3 operations must receive specific training that is approved by the Ministry of Training, colleges, and universities. Therefore, for the purposes of this course, we will briefly review some of the measures and procedures for Type 3 operations. Type 3 operations include the same requirements as the Type 2 operations, such as signage, appropriate PPE, waste containers, and disabling the ventilation system, but also require additional strict control measures, including all movable items such as furniture, window coverings, etc. must be removed, and items that cannot be removed must be cleaned, covered, and sealed prior to work being done. Temporary walls may be constructed to seal off the work area from the remaining workplace. Walls and floors must be covered with durable polyethylene with overlapping and taped seams. Negative air pressure maintained within the enclosure. Decontamination procedures, also known as showering out, must be in place and followed by all workers when entering and exiting the work area. Decontamination procedures must be followed with Type 3 procedures every time workers enter or exit the work area. Clean and dirty change rooms are separated by a shower area, where workers can clean themselves before entering the clean area. Type 3 operations require a negative pressure of 0.02 inches of water inside the enclosure relative to the area outside the enclosure. This is accomplished by running negative air units equipped with HEPA filters inside the enclosure and venting them outside, and making sure that the enclosure is sealed from the surrounding area. This is measured using a manometer. The negative air unit should be DOP tested to ensure integrity of the HEPA filter. Upon completion of a Type 3 operation, clearance air samples must be taken from inside the enclosure. Clearance air sampling is conducted by a qualified consultant who runs an air pump in the enclosure, passing a prescribed amount of air through a filter. The contents of the filter is then examined by a lab, who can visually identify asbestos fibers under a microscope and determine the quantity, if any, that are in the air. The number of fibers should not exceed 0.01 fibers per milliliter of air to be considered a pass. Please also note that a worker member of the PDSB Multi-Workplace Joint Health and Safety Committee has the right to be present at the beginning of testing in order to verify that the correct testing measures are done and that the results will be valid. Within 24 hours after the clearance air testing results are received at the site location, the principal or site manager shall post a copy of the results or report in a conspicuous location within the workplace, such as the location's Health and Safety Bulletin Board. Please also keep a copy in your red binder. How will you know that asbestos repair or removal work is happening at your location? In addition to any information you may receive directly from your supervisor, you will receive an email with a hazardous materials work notification. The message is sent to all building staff, all custodial floater staff, the area facility management, and any other pertinent persons. The notification will include the room or area where the work is being done, what is being done, the date the work is expected to take place, and a board project coordinator contact. You can contact this person if you have any questions or concerns. Note, there may be emergency situations where a notification cannot be created before the work is done. In these cases, your supervisor and the board will communicate with you as soon as possible. We will discuss how asbestos information is communicated in the work order system more in Chapter 6. Check-ins and pre-construction site meetings. Upon arrival and sign-in at the main office, contractors are also required to check in with custodial staff. Contractors shall review the full scope of work with custodial staff prior to commencement. For projects, administrators, site supervisors, and custodial staff will be included in all site pre-construction meetings. For abatements, administrators, site supervisors, and custodial staff will be included in all site pre-abatement meetings or pre-commencement work area inspections. Administrators, site supervisors, and custodial staff have the right to stop any work at any time when they believe asbestos-containing material, ACM, may be disturbed. In this chapter, we have discussed asbestos legislation in Ontario, including the types of operations and the measures and procedures for the different types of operations. The next chapter to be discussed is the Peel District School Board's, PDSB, Asbestos Management Program, or AMP. The PDSB has developed an AMP that outlines a comprehensive system to manage all ACM as per OREG 27805. The AMP applies to all buildings and structures under the control, occupancy, and administration of the PDSB to protect the safety of all PDSB employees, students, visitors, and contractors. The primary elements of the AMP include the following sections. 1. Roles and responsibilities of those involved in maintaining and/or removing asbestos-containing materials. 2. The process for creating and maintaining asbestos surveys and inventories. 3. The process for maintaining, repairing, and removing asbestos-containing materials, including in emergencies. 4. Education for PDSB staff regarding the AMP, including accessing inventories and reporting damaged ACM. 5. The establishment of procedures for the notification and procurement of contractors and consultants, if required, for the completion of Type 1, Type 2, and 3 operations. 6. Procedures for emergency response due to flooding, fire, or discovery of disturbed materials. To access and read the full Asbestos Management Program document and other asbestos-related material, click the link. The AMP includes a list of all locations with asbestos surveys. Asbestos inventories can be found on a location's Health and Safety Bulletin Board or in the red binder. Custodial, maintenance, and supervisory staff can also review asbestos information in eBase, which we will review shortly. All PDSB staff has the following responsibilities under the AMP. Be familiar with and work in compliance with the requirements of the ACM as it applies to their work. Understand that access to areas above a false ceiling that contains sprayed fireproofing is prohibited. Upon discovery of any damaged ACM, immediately notify your supervisor and principal for repair and suspend any activities that may lead to further damage. Be aware of any materials in your work area that may be ACM. Do not damage or clean up any debris or material that may contain asbestos. What role does an administrator or building manager play in managing ACM? Stop any work that is being conducted in contravention of the AMP and contact the PDSB personnel who authorize the work. Immediately notify the facilities manager or maintenance services if damaged ACM is detected in the workplace, as per Appendix B of the AMP. Respond to staff questions and concerns in consultation with other board parties. Another important part of the Asbestos Management Program outlines how the board will retain information about asbestos-containing materials in our buildings. As per OREG 27805, employers are required to create a record or inventory of all asbestos-containing materials in the workplace. The inventory should include the material, location, quantity, type of asbestos, friability, and its condition. The inventory must be updated at least once every 12 months. How do we create an asbestos inventory? At the PDSB, we retain third-party consultants to create asbestos surveys. These surveys are room-by-room location inspections, where materials are visually observed and material samples taken and tested if required. Asbestos surveys are conducted at regular intervals, and information is compiled in an asbestos survey report. Within the asbestos survey report is the asbestos inventory. The asbestos inventory is the most current information about asbestos at a location. Let's pause for a moment and discuss two important concepts that make up how an asbestos inventory is created. The first is the concept of homogeneous areas when sampling for asbestos. Homogeneous means of the same kind or alike. When sampling materials for asbestos, the law allows sample results to apply to multiple areas within a building, so long as the material is homogeneous in each area. The number of samples required when material is homogeneous is specified in the regulation. This means that we would not have sample results for each room if the material is the same throughout the building. The results of the samples apply to all rooms with the same material. For example, a school built in 1965 has 10 classrooms with the same blue vinyl floor tiles. Samples of the floor tiles are taken from 3 classrooms and analyzed. They all test positive for asbestos. Because all of the classrooms were built in the same time period and all tiles visually look the same, the assumption can be made that all blue tiles in the 10 classrooms are asbestos-containing. All 10 classrooms will be listed in your asbestos inventory as having ACM floor tiles. The second concept to review is confirmed versus suspect or presumed ACM. As we reviewed earlier, the only way to know for certain that a material contains asbestos is through a laboratory analysis. This is confirmed ACM. Suspect or presumed ACM is a material that has been visually identified to be asbestos-containing by a qualified consultant, but no sample was taken. Consultants make this determination based on the type of material, its appearance, and age of the building. This is done in some circumstances where sampling a material may cause damage or when a material is inaccessible. Suspect or presumed ACM must still be included in a building's asbestos inventory and must be treated as if it were confirmed asbestos in how it is handled, removed, and disposed. Once a survey and inventory are created, asbestos inventories are updated by health and safety when asbestos-containing materials are identified and/or removed as part of repair or renovation work done through other board departments as described in the AMP. When inventories are updated, a new copy is sent to the location to be placed in the red binder and posted on the Health and Safety Bulletin Board, as well as uploaded to the work order system for maintenance contractors. For the most current information about asbestos at a location, check the Health and Safety Bulletin Board or the location's red binder, which is located in the custodial office. The red binder contains the most current asbestos inventory and reports about specific removal work done at the location. Custodial, maintenance, and supervisory staff also have access to eBase, where asbestos information is stored electronically. You can view asbestos inventories, surveys, and other asbestos documents in the eBase Hazardous Substances module. You can also see information about asbestos for a given building when creating and reviewing work orders. We will review both these methods in more detail in Chapter 6. The following procedures shall be adhered to in the event that any asbestos or suspect asbestos-containing materials are damaged or otherwise disturbed during routine maintenance, construction, etc. 1. Suspend all activities at risk of disturbing the material in question. 2. Where practical, or where such actions will not interfere with established emergency or fire routes, isolate the area in question. 3. Shut down or otherwise isolate ventilation systems to or from the affected area. 4. Notify the immediate supervisor and principal building manager if different from the supervisor to commence arrangements for abatement. 5. Where requested, the individual workers engaged in the work shall file an incident report detailing events leading up to and immediately following the discovery of the damaged asbestos. 6. In case of any emergency maintenance work shall proceed as set out in Appendix B of the AMP. We'll review a case study of how the emergency response procedures works in more detail in Chapter 7. In this chapter, we reviewed the PDSB Asbestos Management Program, or AMP, its contents, and where to find a copy. We also reviewed the difference between an asbestos survey and asbestos inventory, and where to find these documents. We also reviewed what to do if you find disturbed ACM. In this chapter, we will go through some case studies to understand how asbestos-containing materials are managed. In this chapter, we'll review two common scenarios of asbestos work at PDSB. a planned project, in this example replacing the flooring in a classroom, and repair of ACM pipe insulation. In each scenario, let's look at the process for identifying and communicating the removal of ACM. Upon receipt of the project supervisor, as part of their initial planning, will review asbestos information to determine if any materials in the room, and in particular any materials that are to be disturbed, are ACM. To see a building's asbestos inventory, log into eBase with your Active Directory credentials. Then from the left side panel, hover over the Hazardous Substances icon and then select Hazardous Substances. In the Hazardous Substances module, to select a facility, use the Filters option on the left side of the page, or simply click on the facility name from the list of facilities. Once a facility has been selected, its asbestos inventory will come up. Displayed on the screen is all rooms in a facility. If a room has an ACM record, you will see the date of asbestos record on the right-hand side of that line. Click on each line for more detailed information on the ACM. You can also create a PDF asbestos inventory document to give to a contractor or to attach to a project bid. Do this by clicking on the ACM Room Report button. You can also click the Documents button on the same screen. This will take you to a list of ACM documents available for this facility, such as previous asbestos surveys, removal reports, and consultant reports. Once the project supervisor has information on ACM, they can communicate it to the contractor who will be doing the work on the project. This ensures that ACM is not disturbed or is removed safely if a contractor is working in the area. Once the project has begun, and when the ACM is going to be removed, the project supervisor will fill out a hazardous materials work notification. All occupants of the building where ACM removal work is being performed will get this notification, as we saw in Chapter 4. If a consultant has been hired to oversee the ACM removal or repair project, their information will also be listed in the notification. To ensure compliance with OREG 27805, an environmental consultant may be hired to oversee the ACM abatement project. If an environmental consultant has been hired, they will issue an abatement report. As previously discussed, the Health and Safety Department reviews all notifications as well as reports issued by the consultants, such as visual inspection reports and asbestos abatement reports. If the removal is significant, such as the removal of all ACM vinyl floor tiles in a classroom, the Health and Safety Department, upon receipt of the notification, will update the asbestos inventory to indicate that the floor tiles in this room are no longer ACM. Once this is done, Health and Safety will email the location's administrators, custodians, and facilities manager to indicate that the asbestos inventory has been updated and that an updated paper copy of the inventory is being couriered over to the location to place in their red binder. This way, updated information is available both electronically in eBase and on paper at the location. In this example, the project manager sees that the room floor tiles they need to replace are ACM. They inform the contractor. Before the work begins, the project manager creates a hazardous materials work notification. The contractor performs the asbestos abatement using Type 2 procedures. A consultant oversees the work and produces a report. The report is sent to the school as well as uploaded as a document to eBase. Once the work is complete, Health and Safety updates the asbestos inventory in eBase and sends the principal, head custodian, or lead hand and facility manager an updated asbestos inventory. In our second scenario, a consultant at a school performing an inspection determines that a section of pipe insulation has deteriorated due to age and is in need of repair. The consultant reports the findings to the department who hired them to do the work, who then advises maintenance services of the location and condition of the material. The maintenance department will raise a work order to engage a contractor for the repair. We can check if materials in a room are ACM through the work order module in eBase. When creating a work order, if an asbestos inventory has been added to a facility, you will see a red banner that says, "The selected facility has asbestos-containing materials." Click on the View button for specific details. A window will then open to show which rooms have ACM and what the material is. Once a work order has been created and dispatched to a contractor, the contractor must acknowledge that they have reviewed the asbestos information for that location directly in eBase. As well, the contractor can print a copy of the work order to give to the person from the contracting company who will actually be doing the work. The asbestos inventory will be printed directly on the work order. When the removal is going to occur, the maintenance supervisor will create a hazardous materials removal notification. A consultant may be hired depending on the scope of the project to ensure compliance with OREG 27805. The Health and Safety Department will monitor these notifications and update the location's asbestos inventory if needed. All these measures help ensure everyone is aware what is an asbestos-containing materials in our buildings, so that materials are not disturbed or removed in a safe manner. In this example, a section of pipe insulation is observed to be damaged and in need of repair. When raising the work order, a maintenance supervisor verifies through asbestos inventory, as accessed via the work order system, that the insulation is ACM. The work is dispatched and the contractor is notified via the work order of the ACM. Before the work begins, the supervisor creates a hazardous materials work notification. The contractor performs the asbestos abatement using Type 2 procedures. Once the work is complete, Health and Safety reviews the notification but determines that no update to the asbestos inventory is needed since only one small section of piping was repaired. The final chapter to be discussed is the Peel District School Board's, PDSB, Asbestos Management Program, or AMP. Let's review the steps taken when there is an urgent or emergency response required to deal with an asbestos disturbance. Remember, these steps are outlined in Appendix B2 of our updated Asbestos Management Plan. In this scenario, a head custodian, upon entering a storage room, discovers that a portion of the ceiling has become saturated with water and debris has fallen onto the room floor. The source of the water is a roof leak. The custodian immediately closes the room without disturbing the debris and advises their facility manager and school principal. Whether you know if the damaged material is ACM or not, the first step in emergency response is to secure the area. In collaboration with the administrator and facility manager, custodians should ensure no one else enters the room by locking the door and/or adding signage. If the room has mechanical ventilation, shut off the ventilation to the room. See Appendix E of the updated Asbestos Management Program for more information. The custodian, in collaboration with their facility manager, then reviews the asbestos inventory for the school. This can be done either electronically via eBase or by reviewing the paper copy of the asbestos inventory in the red binder. The facility manager or principal can also call the Health and Safety Department for additional consultation. To review the asbestos inventory in eBase, follow the slides on the Hazardous Substances module shown in Chapter 6. Here are some tips when reviewing the asbestos inventory. Review information for the particular room where there has been a disturbance. If the particular material you are looking for is not listed, this means that there is no record of an ACM in that room. Review entries in the asbestos inventory under Building Interior. These are materials that are present throughout the building. Review previous removal notifications. The material in question may have been previously identified, removed, and replaced. Scan the entire asbestos inventory to see if the same material has been identified as ACM in another part of the building. In this scenario, it has been discovered that the drywall joint compound in the ceiling is asbestos-containing. Note that in some situations, there may not be enough information to be exactly sure whether or not the material in question is ACM or not. In these cases, the board will respond as if the material was ACM and proceed with emergency remediation. Subsequently, the custodian will raise a work order for the repair or removal of the affected areas of the ceiling and clean up the debris. The Maintenance Department Project Supervisor, who is assigned the work order, will follow the same steps we reviewed in Chapter 6 to confirm the presence of ACM in the asbestos inventory. An environmental consultant may be hired depending on the scope of the project. Maintenance will dispatch a trained contractor in asbestos removal to remove the sections of damaged ceiling and clean up the debris. The leak will also be addressed by the Maintenance Department, but in this module, we are focusing on the impacted ACM only. Once the remediation is complete, the rest of the repair work can continue. During an emergency, it may not be possible for the maintenance department to create a hazardous materials work notification before the work is dispatched. However, a notification will be created as soon as possible. In the meantime, the facility manager is responsible for keeping the custodial team informed of the work, and the administrator is responsible for communicating information about the work to the rest of the building staff throughout this response. As in previous chapters, the Health and Safety Department will monitor notifications. If the amount of ACM remediated impacts the asbestos inventory, the Health and Safety Department will update the asbestos inventory in eBase and send new paper copies of the asbestos inventory to the administrators and lead hand or head custodian to update the red binder and Health and Safety Bulletin Board. What are the key messages of this eModule you should know? Asbestos was widely used in the manufacture of building materials up to the late 1970s in Canada. Exposure to asbestos can have serious health risks. The board has created asbestos inventories for all board locations that were built up to 1990. You can read the inventory in eBase or in the location's red binder. The board has an asbestos management program to ensure ACM is maintained and removed safely. You can read a copy of the AMP online. Do not disturb ACM at your location and report any disturbed materials you may find in the course of your work to your supervisor.